Welcome to the East End Fellowship Podcast. My name is Nathan Walton, co-lead pastor of East End Fellowship. And joining me today is Diamond Walton, who, among other things, happens to be my wife. Diamond has a background in public health and has also had a career in philanthropy. And most recently, she was awarded the Magdalena Walker Emerging Leader Award for some of her entrepreneurial work addressing the racial wealth gap. And so in today's conversation, we are engaging questions of how the church and capitalism relate to one another and how race intersects with those topics. And so I hope you enjoy our discussion. I'm really excited today because I have the pleasure of having a conversation with Diamond Walton, who, among other things, happens to be my wife. So I'm excited about that. But, other things that I kind of made me really interested in this conversation is, your career, right? You've had a career in public health. You've had a career in philanthropy. Most recently, you've kind of been flexing some entrepreneurial muscle, doing some work on the racial wealth gap. You are a recent winner of the Magdalena Walker Emerging Leader Award. And so, I'm excited about kind of the intersection of all those things for you vocationally. But the other thing that I'm really interested in us talking through at some point or within this conversation is really about how faith informs all that work, right? So you've done work in public health and, engaging with health equity at the grassroots level. You've also done work in terms of philanthropic work and how to fund initiatives that are making people's lives better. But you also do that because of Jesus. And that to me is really cool. And I'm excited about us having a chance to kind of think through some of those interconnections. Kind of the working title for this is really about capitalism in the church. And more broadly thinking about like economics in the church. And, on one level, I think, obviously you've had some experience vocationally engaging with some of these issues, but also just as a believer thinking about them. And I'm, selfishly very excited about this because my own dissertation was on the prosperity gospel and thinking through like, how do things like capitalism and consumerism intersect with church practice, intersect with theology, impact people's lives? And so this should be fun. And I'll say, one of the things I like to do, especially when we're talking about terms and topics that can be loaded and can mean different things to different people, is to like do a bit of definitional work, right? And so I think a term that we'll probably use a lot in this conversation is capitalism, which I think means different things to different people and also is like changed over time historically, right? But I'll say for myself, when I think about capitalism, like one aspect of it is like the technical definitions of it and things that characterize most forms of capitalism, like, private ownership of the means of production, or thinking about like having a free market economy and competition, or thinking about, literally the use of capital to increase profit and create surplus profit, all those things. So to me, that's like part of like what often typifies capitalism. But then there's this whole other side of capitalism to me, which is more around formation and the values that are kind of suggested by the way that capitalism functions. And, whether that's self-interest and like trying to maximize what you can get out of something, or whether that's thinking about the role of things like consumerism in the church or in society where, we are consuming things, but that's tied to, marketing and what it means to get people to want something and the cultivation of desire, like all those things, right? There's like this other layer of how capitalism functions that makes people feel things and then makes people do things. Mm-hmm. And one, I think that's just a fascinating topic, but it's also something that I think does have a lot of implications for how the church functions, especially the American church, because we're in a capitalistic society. And so we'll get into some of that. But I kind of want to, in terms of the trajectory, I'd love for us to talk a little bit about kind of your own journey with thinking about some of these issues, and then kind of talk a bit about the church and, how do we understand the church's relationship to some of these broader social realities. So let's begin with you. And, as you think about the relationship between economics generally and the church generally, like what have maybe been key moments in your life or key experiences or things you witnessed or whatever that have kind of shaped how you've understood how those two things relate to each other, right? Church on the one hand and economics on the other. What comes to mind for you?
Yeah, I don't think I initially made the connection between economics and the church. What my initial connection was in terms of kind of understanding the role that finance plays in our everyday life was to my profession. So,
Mm.
I spent like a decade as a public health educator, and a lot of my work really was centered on like identifying the health disparities that were popping up in communities around the country, and just seeing that Black folks in particular were living sicker and dying quicker. So
Mm.
as read research study after research study and started to see particularly the disparities in maternal mortality and infant mortality, I was like, what is causing this? And a lot of times the researchers would say, there's a disparity, and Black mothers are dying at higher rates, or Black communities are sicker, and they're also these communities are also impoverished. So those two intersecting kind of identities were like persistent in these studies.
Mm.
And what I kept thinking was, we're not gonna we can't prevent the fact that people are Black, but we can maybe do something about the fact that folks are poor, and what are ways that we could start in actually using like investments in communities of color, or shifting the distribution of wealth so that communities of color could actually have the resources to create the lives and the sense of wellness and well-being that they deserve and that they're seeking. And so that was kind of my foray, or my initial spark of like, oh, maybe finance is some kind of linchpin in this conundrum that we're in. And so then I started thinking about, well, why are we in this financial situation? And started to think through kind of what are the values that people have around money? How is that connected to kind of issues of systemic racism? And how are those kind of perpetuating these consistent instances of wealth inequality that then have these offshoots of things like health disparities, or racialized violence, or other things like that. So that's really kind of where the seed got planted and started to sprout. And from there, I was like, okay, I need to learn more about finance. I need to learn about how it actually works. I need to start examining all of these assumptions that I have about money, and what I'm striving toward and how I'm using it, because I'm realizing that it has a lot more unintended consequences than I had initially realized. And I think other people aren't recognizing that either.
Mm.
So yeah, that's when I started to think about like, how am I using money? How does that connect with my faith? And what does that mean for me?
Wow, wow. So I'm curious, as you began to kind of think through those issues, did you feel like there were ways that the church spoke into those issues as they were forming for you? Do you feel like churches talked a lot about those connections? I feel like there's like a broader kind of dynamic in churches where they're often trying to think through like, what is the relationship between our church and like our broader society and some of these inequities and societal disparities? And so I guess I'm curious, like what role did the church play in some of your early thinking around some of these connections?
Yeah, I think the church had a lot more to say around just the issue of poverty. There
Yeah.
are poor people around us, we should help them. So that's really the conversation around money that I experienced at church. There wasn't a lot of talk about like economic systems. We never really talked about kind of the system in which we make decisions about money.
Mm.
And we didn't always talk about like the intersections between kind of our experience of racism, or racialized history, or systemic racism, and money. And so I really didn't have a sense of where the church stood on the topic, or what biblical guidance there was on the matter. I heard about like certain people that I may not, I don't want to like call out people's names, but like there's certain like financial educators that were propagated in church circles to kind
Mm-hmm.
of give you a sense of how you should be using money, and what are like the right principles around money and right stewardship of financial resources. But even in that kind of education and socialization around money, it was still very much aligned with the traditional ways in which people manage money, even if you were not a Christian. And so there were not a lot of inputs or resources to kind of give very clear, theologically sound, biblically rooted advice and guidance around what is money for, how are we using it as a church, as an institution, as families, as people who are part of a community together, and what are the implications for the broader community based off of the decisions that we make with money. So
Mm. Wow. Wow. What you said kind of reminds me of how I feel like two things are often happening in churches, right? There's an aspect in which a lot of times churches aren't explicitly naming some of these connections or really equipping people to understand them and engage in them. And at the same time, churches are performing something because they're actually shaping us to think a certain way. Even especially when we talk about stewardship or whatever, like they're shaping us to think about money in certain ways, even if they aren't making explicit how it relates to like some of these other systems that are really at play. And I kind of have a question around that, right? Like in what ways do you feel like capitalistic sensibilities, capitalistic ways of thinking show up in churches? How does it affect the way that churches engage in their lives together? How does it affect just Christians in general? How do you feel like capitalistic sensibilities shape us?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it goes back to what I was sharing around how some of us were socialized around how to manage money in the church and some of the resources that we were given in Christian spaces around like personal finance. And a lot of times when we think about personal finance, it is very individual and very like just for your home. And you think about, okay, how am I saving for my personal retirement? How am I making sure that I personally acquire the assets that I want and desire or signal some kind of good life? And if and the unspoken thing that happens is that when you view folks who have wealth or means, there is a connection to like piety or goodness. And if someone seems like they're not managing money well, or they do not have money or in poverty, there's some sin or some problem or some issue. And so what isn't explicitly said is that if you have money, you are good. And if you don't have money, you are bad. And we see this in broader culture in general. There's a lot of notoriety and attention directed toward ultra wealthy individuals. There's the assumption that they have something to say, that we should listen to them, that they are correct, because the belief is that because they have amassed so much wealth, they must be doing something right. They must be doing something good. But if we are thinking about people who are impoverished, do not have any wealth, they do not have status. What they have to say is not held as in high regard as someone who has a lot of wealth. And so I think some of those understandings or these kind of connections to kind of spiritual goodness or religious goodness or goodness in general, and how that's linked with financial success and resources, is kind of socialized in the church as well. And part of that is that there is kind of this elevation of some of the capitalistic principles that really are focused around like personally owning things for yourself and your family and not thinking more communally. And so, as you mentioned, in a capitalist system, there's really private ownership of the means of production and how what you're producing is being kind of bought and sold on the market. And there isn't a lot of thought about what is the impact of what you're producing on the planet or on other people. So for example, if you're using labor to produce your thing, then you should be thinking about the impact of the first person who's contributing their labor to help you generate whatever product that you want. If you're more focused on like quality products so you can make the most money off of this product, you're going to think less about those other people or about the planet. And so there is not a lot that the church speaks into around, like, as you're striving for this good life, how are you impacting other people? Because kind of the principles that we're pulling in, or just assuming that people are going to draw on to get this good life, are the right ones. And typically they're very secular principles for how we should be engaging with money and with other people on the planet.
Yeah, wow. To me, one kind of sub-theme in what you shared is the role of individualism in a lot of this. And as I think about like kind of capitalism and how it functions and all that, I'm like, man, like we are to your point, like we are shaped to think about like what's best for me, like how do I accumulate wealth or do this or that. And I think what's interesting about that too is a lot of times when we think about those things, we aren't necessarily being shaped to think about it in terms of sustenance. We're thinking about surplus. Like, how can I have all the things, right? And then we lace that with scripture, right? We say, the wealth of the wicked is laid up in store for the righteous, right? King James. And so, because I hear these things in church all the time. But like to me, it's like, oh, there's a way that we, to your point, like we're thinking about ourselves and how we can achieve and how we can do all these things. And to me, that then spills over into how we think about ourselves communally too, right? As a church, especially, because it's like, even as we're talking about addressing things like poverty, for example, as a church, if our basic sensibility is you as an individual can pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, then we're not going to have as much emphasis on how do we as a church address the systems that are leading to a situation of poverty for someone or for our community. Because the assumption is that, through your faith and your piety and your prayer or whatever, or through your hard work, like, you can do it. And it's like, well, like, how do we break out of that to have a more communal sensibility? I think another way this plays a role is, like, even in terms of how churches relate to other churches, because I think because churches are so autonomous within America, it's like I think we end up valuing competition as opposed to collaboration, which also is a kind of a core capitalistic value, right? Like, how do we be the ones who kind of can own all the programming and do all the things, as opposed to saying, how do we see ourselves as part of a bigger whole? And so I guess my question with that is, like, how do you feel like we can break out of the hyper individualism to then become more communal in how we think about our engagement with economics, our engagement with poverty, our engagement with helping people to materially flourish? How do we have a more communal sensibility around that?
Yeah, it's such a huge question. I think the place to start is to realize that, we are really only as strong as our weakest community member. And I know a lot of people say that, but it is the reality. And folks' experiences of poverty or like the lack of resources, basic things that they need in their lives will ultimately impact us in some way or the other. And I think it's really important to just keep in mind that just because we may feel that we have what we need now, there may be a time where we may not. And so if we're not like socializing our communities, building up the infrastructure to kind of support each other in the ebbs and flows of our financial situations, then we will be the ones that are left out kind of in the cold if we're in a financial situation that it's hard to get out of. And so I think what I'm excited about and what I'm hopeful for are really just more people thinking more creatively about how do we like stop holding up capital as this idol, as this thing that we're worshiping, and really start using it as just a tool to actually advance God's kingdom. Because I think there are a lot of ways that because we live such an individualized life that it kind of pulls us deeper and deeper into the trap of capitalism or racialized capitalism, which really has like even a more pronounced impact on communities of color, where like, for instance, because we have to like figure out a way to survive in retirement, we have to like have all these like, for example, sometimes people become landlords. I don't think everybody wants to become a landlord, but they become a landlord because they need an extra asset and they need an extra stream of income to make sure that they can retire in a timely manner. And so we end up in these positions where we have to be in these types of relationships with people where like we're a landlord, someone is renting from us, and we create kind of these extractive relationships just because we have this need that we feel like we have to personally meet for ourselves. But if we were living in a more communal way, more intergenerational way, a more interracial way, there would be opportunities for people as they, through the whole life cycle, are cared for, that they have what they need, and that because we are not so scared that if anything happens, we have to just depend on ourselves, so we have to hoard, with that fear gone, we won't have to be striving and working so hard, which kind of goes to the point that I think we might be talking about in a little bit around us. This actually is preventing us from actually engaging in one of the main core commandments that God has called us to, which is to rest. And so we really don't have opportunities to be living out the call that Jesus has put on our lives to like actually rest, reflect on who he wants us to be, how he wants us to show up, because we're just striving so hard to maintain a living and make sure that we feel secure enough with the resources that we have.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, it's a reminder of how capitalism shapes us, right? Because what it pushes us to do is to think about how we should prioritize a certain type of productivity. And we have a certain vision of what being productive means and having enough means and all those things. And yeah, when you mentioned, when you were talking earlier, what also made me think about is how, like, I feel like at a very basic level, Christians very often talk about being the body of Christ, but we don't actually believe it. right? Because part of what you named, I think the way you phrased it was, we're only as strong as our weakest member. But we don't function as if we are actually members of the same community because of the way that individualism functions, which to me is it's connected to the way capitalism functions. And I'm like, man, life would be a lot different if we actually saw ourselves as deeply connected with our neighbor, and in particular connected with neighbors who don't look like us.
Yeah.
Which is one other thing I want to talk about, because we talked about kind of capitalism and how that can not only show up in the church but shape the church. Like, you layer that with race, and it's a whole thing,
Whole thing.
right? And I'm curious, how do you feel like capitalistic sensibilities kind of affect or impact how the church engages in race, or how people engage in racial justice or reconciliation?
Yeah, well, so I mentioned the term racial capitalism a little while ago,
Yeah.
and racial capitalism, it was coined by a professor. I don't want to misspeak about his name, but a Black academic who was really kind of bringing to the fore that for capitalism to really function well, the systemic racism has to be a core tenet, because there has to be a way in which you devalue a person's skill or identity to the point where you're okay with exploiting them. And that's really how you are successful in a capitalistic system, is you have to be putting in less than what you're taking out. And so in the example of slavery, you're not paying the workers to produce cotton, for example, for you. So there's zero cost going into producing this product, but there's only an upside. There's just a gain. And
Surplus profit.
to be able to create that kind of business model, you have to devalue people. And so particularly as communities of faith who are really trying to live in a multi-ethnic, multiracial community and really try to understand, what does that mean for us today, we have to come to terms with the fact that some of the ways in which we ourselves are becoming wealthy or accruing resources are at the expense of other people. And so it's really up to us to really understand, whatever we're getting, it's at what cost. So whether they're the products that we're purchasing, the food that we're eating, the homes that we live in, the services that we receive, at whose expense are we getting the upside? And so I think that really is part of us coming to terms with how the two kind of work together to bolster the impact of capitalism, because there has to be kind of some source of some input on the other one end of the spectrum. And by not acknowledging that, you can't kind of cut it off and reorient yourself to a new way of living. So, yeah.
That's super helpful. To me, it's there's so many ways in which we are, earlier I alluded to us being a body, right, being the body of Christ, but then we actually function separately. So there is this distance that we have from people, but then I think part of what you're naming is there's also a distance from the process,
Yes.
or the process we're engaging in, right? So so you have, Karl Marx, who talks about how capitalism leads to alienation, right? Because we are, the person who's getting the products is separated from the producer. And so then it's out of sight, out of mind as to how we got this product or this thing, or who it exploited and all those things, right? And so to me, part of what I hear and what you're saying is there's an opportunity for us to be more aware of how the everyday practices we're engaging in are actually not only being engendered by people who we may not even see, but also are continuing to impact those people. And yeah, to me, that's an opportunity for the church to kind of help. Not that the church has been great at this, but there's still an opportunity. The church needs help, but the dream is for the church to actually be an agent of both education and formation with some of this stuff. And but race is an interesting thing, right? Because it affects so much of or it's affected by so much of how capitalism functions. And I feel like the most glaring example for me has been the prosperity gospel in terms of it being impacted by kind of certain notions of consumerism and that type of thing. But then downstream of the prosperity gospel, because in my own life, I know people who are of color who've been exploited within those types of communities. And so it's man, this is actually having a disparate impact as well on people of color. And I also think about like even when people are trying to serve the community or engage in some of the work you're talking about, a lot of times people are shaped by certain notions of scarcity, right? So like, oh, I don't have time to help or time to give or time to research to know how to make an impact, or I don't have the resources because I need to make sure I have enough for myself, right? So all these become these capitalistic gestures that end up impacting other people who have less power, right? And yeah, it's like, and it also impacts what you mentioned earlier. You talked about how one of the commandments is to rest, right? And so, because we're not functioning interdependently, there are people who get a lot, and there are other people who are not able to actually rest or really enjoy the little that are able to produce. And so I want to kind of go there because you've already alluded to it, right? Like, I know you've been doing a lot of thinking and research around like Jewish practices of Sabbath, Jewish practices of Jubilee. I'm curious, what do you feel like the church has to learn from those practices as it relates to living in a capitalistic society?
I love this topic. I mean, it's like I feel like it's been like such a bright shining star in like my recent experience of my faith journey. And mostly because it eliminates, well, Jubilee in particular just illuminates the need to be released from so many things that are holding us from like one being in relationship with each other, from being in right relationship with the planet, and then like this particularly being in right relationship with God. And
And what is,
so
can you, just in case people don't know, what is Jubilee? What
yeah,
do you mean by that?
Jubilee. Well, or maybe you can like fill in
Sure,
the
yeah.
full historical details, but like in the Hebrew scriptures, there is a moment of Jubilee, which is like the seventh year of the seventh Jubilee, I believe, the seventh Sabbath year.
Yeah, yeah.
So
So
it's like every 50 years.
yeah, when debts are forgiven,
When debts
land
are
is able
forgiven,
to rest.
land is able to rest, and yeah, and there's like a moment of kind of repentance and rest after that, and like this community wide kind of forgiveness of debts, returning of land, the intersection between not just people resting, animals resting, and the land resting, just really demonstrates the need for us to not be constantly working and having our whole lives just being surrounded by our identities and the professions that we have or what we're able to produce. And so that's one aspect of it. And then the other very connected aspect is the resting, is the Sabbath. And the Sabbath, I think in modern times, it's easy to think about rest in terms as self-care. And I don't view Sabbath as self-care because oftentimes self-care requires someone else to even do more labor so that you can rest. So you think about like going to a resort or getting your nails done, or I don't know, whatever, however people kind of do their relaxation, but it requires more labor. And in the case of being in Sabbath, it's really an intentional time that is allowing for everything to rest, for
It's
everyone to
holistic, yeah.
reset. It's holistic, and I think there's just so much to learn from that rhythm. Like it was a regular thing, and it was communal that. Allowed it pulled people out of kind of the rat race that people. I mean, there's a rat race now. I don't know if it necessarily was a rat race then, but it's a break, and it's a break to really actually reflect and internalize and repair in many instances. So that's been really inspiring to me
Yeah.
lately.
So let's stick on that point because you mentioned rest, but then you also mentioned repair, right? And so it's striking to me how, with Jubilee, you do have this kind of this holistic resting communally, but then you also have like the economic impact of, oh, the land that my family had is now being returned to us. I'm curious, like, how do you think this conversation around rest and repair relates to things like reparations and other ways of addressing, or compensating people for what was taken?
Yeah.
Like, you have thoughts on that? Or the church's role in all that?
Yeah, I think that it would allow for folks to actually rest. I know a lot of folks have to work because they come from families of low wealth. And if you study any of the data around the racial wealth gap, you see that it's because of generations of being their families having wealth extracted from them. So and then other families having the opportunity to accumulate wealth. So thus there creates this gap between two racialized groups of Black folks and white Americans in this instance. And because of that disparity in wealth, then people are just constantly having to work multiple jobs, are not able to actually accrue wealth to pass on to their children, so their children end up in the same cycle. And without a real concerted strategic intervention, there really is no way to get out of this, and the wealth gap is going to continue to grow. And so as I think about Jubilee and I think about the current conversations around reparations, I do think that there are a lot of synergies around the two, where there is an opportunity for a reset, and not just kind of dumping resources onto people and then saying, okay, but really acknowledging like the context in which you are redistributing those resources. So with Jubilee, I mean, folks were given this land back, and there's like a history tied to it. This was land that their families probably had stewarded, but they had to sell because they were in a financial situation where they couldn't maintain it. And so it's really recognizing like the context in which people are in these financial situations, reconciling those financial situations, and thinking through like, how are we actually having faith in this moment? Because when people are going through this experience of Jubilee and debt forgiveness and letting the land rest, it really is a testament to their faith in God. And I think because we are so worried about not having enough because of this scarcity mindset, because we are living in a system of systemic racism and easily kind of discount the value of communities of color, we don't see that it's actually preventing us from showing how much we do trust God. And I think that these opportunities of redistribution of resources, of healing together around our worship of money and how we need to actually reorient that worship to God, and then thinking through like, what is this working out in me, and what kind of aspects of my faith is this developing for me? I think would be a beautiful thing to see in the church.
Wow. I mean, it's striking to me like this idea of how, our unwillingness to do this is in some ways an indictment of our faith. That like, we actually trust that God is enough and God will provide for us if we are not as addicted to all things that capitalism tells us we need to have, or the ways we need to do things. And I mean, I think about that, like, of what does it actually mean to be free from some of this? And one thing in particular that comes to mind for me is William Cavanaugh wrote a book called Being Consumed, and he talks about how oftentimes we think about things like consumerism as meaning an attachment to things like material goods or material needs. And what he says is basically, no, like consumerism is more characterized by detachment. It's actually characterized by insatiability. Like you can never have enough.
You can never have enough.
And so I'm like, oh, so if that's the case, like what does it mean for us to? Because like I think about Israel, right? So like, hey, you're gonna get daily manna, and so when you take too much, it actually is gonna have a bad impact on you. It's gonna spoil. It's gonna rot. It's gonna be maggots, whatever, right? But like in our own lives, we don't believe that. We think we can have all the things, and we feel like if we give to someone else, there's like a zero-sum game, right? So then there's some cost that it's not good stewardship to give or to make these sacrifices. When in reality, it's an expression of faithfulness and faith that God is actually sovereign and the provider.
Yeah.
And so I guess my question with that is like, what do you think can free us from our addiction, especially within the church? Like, what can free us from our addiction to hoarding, our addiction to believing that scarcity really is true, our addiction to all these kind of like manufactured consumeristic needs that blind us from people who really need things in our communities? What can free us to actually trust God with our actual resources?
Yeah. I think the point you raised is just central. How much is enough? And I don't think people ever ask that question, particularly folks who have a lot of resources. If you go to a financial planner or a wealth advisor, they're never going to tell you when you have enough money. They will continue to advise you on how to make more money. And so when you're getting input and guidance on how to use financial resources, no one in that profession, I don't know everybody in the profession, but the standard rule of thumb when you're advising folks on how to be financially healthy and well is not telling them you need to have a stopping point. And so I think for us as believers, we need to start asking ourselves that question. How much is enough? When is it enough? And when we know when we figure that out and we have enough, we need to start making sure others do have enough too. And that really, I think, is will be eye-opening for folks. It's a hard question to answer, and you'll have to do some internal soul searching, and every family situation is different, but I think that's a good starting point. I think the other thing to do is to remember that, we talk a lot about capitalism. People might think, oh, you guys don't like capitalism. What about socialism and all these things? It's like, I think it's important to keep in mind that these are just systems that are made up by people that we have adopted and that we're using. This is not God's system. This is not the church's system. This is not a system to worship. And I think it is helpful for us as Christians to start exploring things with a bit more curiosity, with a bit of more intellectual openness, and to continue to disentangle secular things from our spiritual and religious tenets and values. And so I really encourage Christians in particular to really evaluate the assumption that capitalism is God's system, because it's not. So I think that those two things could be really helpful starting points if you're just wanting to kind of like sit down and think through, okay, how much is enough? I've never thought about that. How can I start kind of thinking through how I will know when I have enough resources and I'm in a position to give even more? Because I think that we can still be generous even if we don't have enough just yet. And then the other thing is just to reevaluate our relationship with the concept of capitalism, our feelings about if we don't kind of ascribe to a capitalistic system, then what do we ascribe to? Just like be free and be open and continue to ask God for guidance on how to relate to this particular system that we're currently in, and remind yourself that this system is not God's system. This is a man-made secular system. So we should treat it as such.
Yeah. I mean, I love that because, I feel like you're highlighting the difference between like the kingdom versus capitalism. Like they aren't the same thing.
They're
right?
not the same thing.
Yeah, and I mean, I love what you said, and what brings to mind for me is like, on the one hand, there are a lot of things that we like it's important to stop and ask, like how much is enough, and those types of things. But I'm also thinking about like how so often our actual conduct is shaped by like habitual practices that shape us over time. Mm-hmm. And as you think about this, like what do you feel like are either individual or even communal practices that can help change the way we think about resources, right? That can help us to understand that the resources we have are not actually ours and not about private ownership, or understand that we actually are connected to our neighbor down the street who may not look like us, or what are there any practices that you think can help us have healthier relationships to economics?
Yeah. I think one thing is to talk about it more often. It feels like a very uncomfortable, scary topic to raise. And so I'm a proponent of talking about salaries or talking about financial needs and being a bit more honest and open about those things, and being more honest and open about how money works. Like, for example, we have good friends who purchased a house, and like a little secret is most people get help purchasing their homes. But oftentimes people feel a lot of shame in feeling like they need to save up enough money to purchase a home and they can't. And so they feel like there's something wrong with them. And so being able to have more open conversations with people in your networks and in your families about money, unpacking kind of your money stories, like where did I get my notions about how money works? Like, did I get it from the church? Did I get it from how I saw my parents manage their money? Like, where did I get that from? So, like, really understanding your personal relationship with money and where are some of the pitfalls so that you know directly where you personally would like to work in those specific areas. And I think the other thing is just to continue to be present and aware of how you're consuming items. I think because there's so much going on in the world, I'm guilty of this. Like, I just want to like numb it away. I'm like, I just need to watch some television. I need to eat some chocolate. I need to just listen to some music, and I don't want to pay attention to it. But I do think it'll be helpful for us all to just be able to show up and really understand what what does it cost to live the life I live? At what cost is it to the people around me, people I don't see, or to the planet? And are there changes I can make in my life so that the cost is less for them? And in some cases, maybe the cost needs to be more for me. So I think those are a few ways to kind of start thinking through
Yeah.
what works for you personally. Because I mean, I don't know what would work for everybody, but I think those are some questions to ask or some conversations to start having.
Yeah. I mean, I love that. I feel like as you're talking, I'm like, oh man, I was trying to think of how many times within the context of the church, I've actually heard explicit conversations about money that weren't, hey, you need to pay your tithe, or hey, we're doing a stewardship or a building campaign, like, and instead was more around like the everyday of like, what does it mean to have a healthy, um, faith informed relationship to our possessions, and I'm like, yeah, maybe. I mean, I think you're right. Like that's one place to start. Like, how do we create that space and do it in such a way that people know they can have the conversation without shame.
Right.
And
Exactly.
because I feel like so much, I feel like oftentimes we're often all asking the same questions, but we don't know anybody else is asking them,
We
right?
are.
And then we all suffer for that, right?
Yeah.
And so wow. So as you think about kind of the ideal of what it could be in terms of how the church and Christians can engage these topics versus kind of where we're at right now, like what gives you hope that the church can progress, or maybe even what glimpses have you seen of believers or just people who are having healthy attachments to possessions?
Yeah, at our church, people are very generous and have been seeing needs and sharing freely, not asking for anything in return, not asking for recognition. Um, I think that's such a beautiful thing. I also see, I've been a financial coach for years, and in talking to people and helping folks work through their personal money stories, like I mentioned before, I think that has been a really cool, liberating experience. And I think that would be a great thing for folks to engage in is really just like, what is my story around money? I think that it would really be helpful in freeing for folks. And I also think that there is a recognition that there has to be some liberation. There really has to be some like debt elimination or some kind of financial reprieve for folks who have been just living under the kind of this oppressive aspect of capitalism, which is like this mass amount of debt that people are living in. And so I think I've seen some examples of that, and there are some faith communities that are like giving away their buildings to people to build affordable housing, or there are folks who are really just trying to think about like what are the assets that we have that we don't need that can actually be contributed to communities that are just trying to like have a decent life.
Mm.
So I think that's been really cool to see folks kind of think outside the box and really be self-aware around the assets and the resources that they have and the excess stuff that they have, and are just like freely giving it away to folks without any kind of
Yeah.
expectation.
I mean, to me, that's like, I think about kind of two different things that if the church does these things well, it can engender what you're talking about because you've named it. Like one has to do with how we understand our relationship to our possessions, right? Like, are these things actually ours? Is it like private property, or
Right.
is it something that has always been God's? And we have an opportunity, responsibility to steward the thing as well. But then also like, are we actually connected to our neighbors, right?
Yes.
Right, and like, do we care about them, and should we care about them, and how should we care about them, right? And how do we recognize that these things that we think are ours actually aren't ours, but they're God's, and then also recognize that other people around us, like we have responsibility to be able to serve and to share in a way that's non-paternalistic and
Yes.
not us being a savior,
Yeah, no, but it's
but it's us
no
being
saviors here.
yeah, but it's us saying like, hey, we believe all the things we have belong to Jesus, and so we want to prayerfully in spirit-led way discern how to use what we have to seek the flourishing of our city and our neighbors. And to me, if we're able to do that as church, we could really be a countercultural witness here,
Yeah.
and I think there's a lot of opportunity there. So you have a lot of thoughts. You've done a lot of research on these topics. I obviously have some questions, but I'm curious if there are any things that you haven't shared that you're like, oh, I want to share this about this topic.
Oh gosh. I'm not sure. I think that, yeah, I mean, like I mentioned, I think the church has a lot to learn from the practice of Jubilee. I think there is a lot to benefit. We could all benefit from experiencing what like a true Sabbath feels like and allowing others to have that experience as well. And I do think that there is something there around our isolation and our disconnection and our overwhelm with what's going on in the world and the way in which we consume things. I think
Yeah.
that we, and I say we, I'm including myself, can get into these habits of kind of distracting ourselves or just being in spaces where we can kind of self-soothe versus actually going toward each other and finding ways to kind of work through, process, be in, really in community with each other. And I think that can contribute to some of our affinity for capitalism because it can give us these dopamine hits that make us feel a little bit better because everything around us feels so terrible, or it can make us feel a little less lonely. And if we purchase this thing or have this particular experience, versus really imagining what it would look like to let go of those things and really think about what does it mean to not try to purchase something to feel a little bit better, but actually turn toward people and figure out how to be better with each other. And I think that is something that would be really cool to see as well, because I think that that could stem a little bit of our needs and dependence on being able to consume and quickly get things cheaply and all that stuff. And allow us to actually have an appetite for something that has more depth and substance than a lot of the superficial stuff that we are just getting fed over and over again in our feeds.
Yeah, yeah. So I have one more question because you're talking to make me think about how, one thing I think about is like the relationship between, having these healthy relationships to economics and all these things, and then also thinking through questions of like racial reconciliation in the church, right? And the reason why I say that is because I feel like I've seen a lot of ways that economics and money has been a hindrance to churches pursuing multi-ethnicity and reconciliation and those types of things. Whether that be once a church tries to value different cultures, people are like, hey, I'm uncomfortable, I'm taking all my money, and just let you know I'm taking my tithe to the church. That's a direct quote. Or if that is, I'm thinking historically about like decades ago, there's something called the homogeneous unit principle, which was basically an idea that was shaped a lot of kind of like the megachurch movement. Not all megachurches, but just some in terms of like saying, hey, the way to kind of grow your church fast is to make sure you got a lot of the same types of people, right? That's the way to kind of, which in many ways is like becomes a vehicle for a capitalistic impulse, right? To make a lot of money, get a lot of people, and you've got a big church. And which is very different than trying to prioritize having different types of people in the same space, right? So I say that to say I feel like there are a lot of like economically driven impulses that kind of resist moves towards a more integrated church. And I'm curious for you, how do we fix that? Is there a productive role that
You're
how
asking me so many easy questions.
yeah, is there a productive role that the role of money can play, or just resources can play in like fostering, um, an actual diverse community that embraces mutuality and interdependence and cross cultural relationality?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like thinking about the structures within the structures within the structures. So, like,
Yeah.
the church model in America is structured like all other nonprofits or sometimes like a for-profit corporation. And so if you're operating within an entity that's its structure is dependent on a model that its purpose and priority is profiting, then that is where the energy is going to go. And so as we think about what kinds of structures and like the environment in which we're creating these interracial communities, it may not be conducive to that type of structure. And so it may require us to like be open our minds wide open to think about like, okay, like in this shift in like the demographics of church and this like tipping point in the church in the US, is there an opportunity for reimagining what this communal space looks like and how it can be more conducive to actually having genuine interracial, multi-ethnic build up relationship, build up resilience, create space for like honest conversation that allows the space
Mm-hmm.
to reconcile and have honest conversation and reconcile, because it's a repeated process. And
Yeah.
so, and to do that and to build a relationship, it takes a lot of time, and time is not capitalism's friend. It wants it fast,
Efficiency.
it wants it to go big, and so how do we think about the models of community that we're trying to build this intergenerational, interracial, multi-ethnic relationships within? And I don't have an answer there, but I do think that that could partially be contributing to the dynamic.
Yeah. I mean, that's really helpful because I'm like, man, it so much of what you named has to do with like how we even like our level of imagination for a different structure for how we even do church, right? Because you're right, we could have a structure that doesn't lend itself to kind of the vision that we're talking about. And as you're talking, I'm just thinking about like Acts chapter 2 and Pentecost, the Spirit falls, people are saved, all these things, people from all these different kind of ethnic backgrounds and language and all that. And then by the end of that chapter, it's talking about them sharing their possessions. And so like those two things are being held together where like you have these people who are diverse coming together, but one of the staples of that community is having a healthy relationship to resources. And
Yes.
so I'm like, man, what does it mean for
Yes.
those things to kind of to be mutually reinforcing in service of the gospel being lived out and experienced.
Exactly.
So yeah, well that's the church has a tall order, but fortunately, Acts chapter 2 is all about the work of the Spirit. So, I trust that the Spirit will lead us. And so,
Yeah.
thank you so much for all of your insights and your time.
Thank you for your questions.
And
They're great.
yeah. Well, that's a wrap.